Thank everybody for joining us today. I'm Shawn Mims, the Research Administrative Manager here, and my colleague, Nickerson, Senior Research Administrators, join us. I want to thank you all for joining us. As we move through the slides, feel free to jump in with questions either in the chat or vocally. Our goal today is to give you a sense of what research administration is and how it connects to you. We hope that you'll come away with knowledge that will be useful to you as you advance through your careers, as to become independent statisticians or faculty members. There are all kinds of processes that happen while you're crunching numbers that allow you to focus on your work without worrying about some of the things that we'll be discussing here today. So some of the people that we work with are an integral part of the business office, and some of those folks are not mentioned here, but they do the day-to-day things like onboarding and offboarding, purchasing supplies and equipment, IT support, organizing the various conferences, seminars, and trainings like this one, and making sure the lab and wet lab and dry lab infrastructure runs smoothly. And they also act as liaisons between other departments. But specifically today, we're going to talk about research administrators. And so here's our group of research administrators. They start with Jane Craycroft, our leader. There's myself and Natalie Vinskus as the research administrator managers. Tongue-tied with that. There's Nancy Breslin, lead research administrator. Again, Love Nickerson, senior research administrator. There's Daniel Long, lead research administrator. Amanda DeJesus, senior research administrator. Lisa Scano, senior research administrator, and our newest member, Yanira Posadas, research administrator. So I wanted to start off with, what is a research administrator? It's a professional who oversees and manages the administration of research activities, primarily within an academic or government institution, sometimes in private sector organizations. The role also involves a wide range of responsibilities like proposal development and submission, award management, regulatory compliance, financial management, contracting, grant administration, and training and development. So why is this important? It's important because it's one of the many components of lessening the burden of cancer. It's also allows you to focus on science and reduces the administrative burden and the amount of time you would have to spend working on non-scientific parts of requesting and managing funds that support your salaries and dealing with regulatory compliance. It's also your tax dollars at work. Most of you in this training are supported by NIH funds. And if it's not NIH funds, it's other non-government sponsors like the American Cancer Society or the Lymphoma Society, just to name a couple. No matter the source of the funding, we have to be good stewards of the funds and part research administration to help achieve that goal. So what do we do? So at a very high level, we do grant management, which is grant application production and financial management. We triage requests across many platforms. That's email, Google Chat, Slack, sometimes text message, and sometimes a head poking in our office, if you have an office these days. We also represent the department in institutional meetings. We also manage long-term projects like clinical trial billing, maintaining a Slack grant support channel, and coordinating meetings with other departments. We also interpret and implement policies, not only Dana-Farber's policies, but federal policies and policies of other institutions. We also interface with other departments and institutions. This slide gives you a sense of how much of the scale of how much this is happening. So for the fiscal year 2023, that's October 2022 to September 2023. 1,200 plus applications were submitted seeking $1.2 billion in funding. 400 plus awards came in for $323 billion. The key thing to note here about this is that we put out a large number of applications, but not all of them get funded. There are also agreements between institutions where we might be providing or receiving funding from from grants that are at other institutions or here. 545 agreements and amendments were executed with other institutions where DFCI was passing funds to other collaborators. There were also 110 subawards that came in from collaborators where collaborators were paying DFCI to support various activities such as MA Stats. So what are some of the resources that we use? Some of the systems, the resources that we use. I'm going to talk about here, but not all of them. So for example, we use PeopleSoft, which I'm sure some of you interact with. That allows us to do human resource and financial management. Eventually, PeopleSoft is going to go away, and we're going to be transitioning to something called Workday, which we're still waiting for that to happen. There's InfoEd, and InfoEd is our award production and management system, where we use it to do grant production and also manage awards after we receive them. There's also ERA Commons, which is used by NIH to track awards, and also we can do various things like initiate progress reports within that system. There's MyNCBI for publication management. There's also Proposal Central, which is a portal used by some foundations to do something similar to the ERA Commons, which is award production and tracking, mostly used by foundations. There's also NIH Reporter, where we can look up NIH funded awards by various parameters such as PI name or grant number, things like that. And then there's the people and departments that we work with. So we work with prime sites and sub-sites. Some of those might be Mass General Hospital, Brigham and Women's, Beth Israel. We also work with other research administrators and other departments, because sometimes funding is passing between the departments. There's the Grants to Contracts Office, Research Accounting for Post-Award Management. There's the Clinical Trials Business Office, where we work with those folks to either put ourselves on budgets for clinical trials or receive funding for clinical trials. There's the Compliance Office, General Counsels, Development for gifts from donors and foundations. And then also the Office of Innovation, where we might be working with them to deal with industry funding. Pre-award, we think about grants and research administration as basically having two sides. There's the pre-award side and the post-award side. Pre-award side dealing mostly with the activities around applying for funding, and the post-award side is around managing the funding once we have it. By the way, I had a fun time playing with DALL-E and ChatGPT to get those images on those slides. It's kind of lovely. I like it. So next slide is the pre-award workflow. It's a deadline-driven process, and I hope today you've actually received the email talking about an update to the deadlines and policy within Dana-Farber. I won't go into that, but you can read that email for all the particulars. But there are three deadlines that are important. There's the department deadline, which is set by the department. This allows us time to review documents within the department, to produce and review the documents. and build the application and resolve any issues. There's the institutional deadline, which is the deadline that the institute needs the documents by. And you've learned that today from the email that's being split into two. I won't go into detail about that. You can read that email. And then finally, there's the sponsor's deadline. And the sponsor's deadline is the deadline by the funder. An application starts a few different ways. Sometimes there's an external collaborator who will say things like for example, somebody at Beth Israel will say, hey, I'm responding to a request for application for a grant. The study I'm proposing it's going to generate a lot of data, and I need some data science support. Hopefully, I know a research administrator from that institution, like Brigham and Women's, will reach out to us, let's say me, and say, hey, my faculty member is going to be submitting a grant and your folks are going to be on it. I'm going to need this, and this, all these various documents and stuff. Or I might already know that research administrator and I can reach out to them proactively to get those documents. Another situation is that a faculty member, one of our faculty members, such as say Jeremy, might want to reply to a request for application. And in that particular situation, he would reach out to his research administrator and say, hey, I'm going to respond to RFA number X, Y, and Z. And that would give you, hopefully, and that would give us a sense of, he would give us a sense of like what he wants to propose in that application. He also might say, hey, I'm also going to be reaching out or collaborating with someone at Mass General. And in that particular case, we need to reach out to Mass General to also ask them for documents that we need for the application. And then finally, there might be an internal situation where someone in, say, pediatric oncology might say, I want to respond to a request for application. And I know that I'm going to need some faculty members' help and also some master statistician time. And in that particular case, we would reach out to that collaborator's research administrator and say, hey, what do you need from me? Here's their salary numbers. Here's what else what do you need from me? And also we might actually have to get financial conflict of interest forms, which I'm sure you guys have seen, and things like that. But in any case, in all of these scenarios, it starts with the request for application. The request for application is going to lay out who's eligible, the application structure, the budget guidelines, special conditions, the duration of the funds, and of course, the aforementioned sponsored deadline. So in the application, we move into the application production stage. This stage involves the actual production of the individual components. The RA will work with the investigator, and we will need to know who will be in the budget and for how much effort, what other costs will there be, and will any part of the budget be going to another institution? And depending upon the sponsor, what is the indirect cost rate? So I wanted to give in the next two slides an example of what a budget might look like. And of course, these are on old budget forms before the system world. So, but it made it easy to sit on the slide. So PI margin of error, yes, it's an old joke, but I had to do it, is being budgeted for 1.2 calendar months or 10% effort, along with an MA statistician calculus stats for 6 calendar months or 50% effort. So we have to calculate what the salary being requested based on those individuals' salary, and then on the effort levels that they're going to have on the project. We also have to calculate the associate fringe, and the fringe rate for Dana-Farber is 28%, but the fringe rate allows us to pay for things like benefits and vacations and things like that. There's also other non-personnel costs that will go on a budget, including computing facilities costs in this case. But there also could be any other costs like lab supplies or external cloud computing services or et cetera. We also have to calculate the facilities and administrative costs, also referred to as the indirect cost or IDC. We apply IDC to the direct research costs to help offset costs like research administrators, this space, tables and chairs, electricity, and other costs that are considered indirect. So right now, Dana-Farber has an indirect cost rate of 78 cents or 78%, which means we get 78 cents for every dollar of direct research costs that are in a budget. For non-government sponsors, the indirect rate or IDC rate can vary depending upon what they allow. Once the budget is determined, it's entered into InfoEd directly. And the next step is collecting and reviewing and uploading documents. This list is some of, but not all of the potential documents that could be required. The sponsor determines the needed documents again and outlines those in the RFA or request for application. I just wanted to highlight a few of the documents that are required. So the biggest one is the biosketch, which on the biosketch, one of the data elements is an ERA Commons account ID, and I hope everyone has one. Because not having one can really hold up an application process or application submission. Also, I hope everyone has a biosketch, because that can also hold up application production, especially among MA stats. There's the previous mentioned budget, and then also its justification. We also gather science documents like specific aims, research plan, resource plans or strategy, the data management sharing plan, which is a relatively new requirement, lab facilities, equipment and resources, protection of human subjects and vertebrate animals, and other documents required by the sponsor. If we're working with another institution who will be in our application or we in theirs, there's coordination and communication that happens to provide or get information and documents needed to pull together a subaward application, which is a subset of these documents. Yes.
Might sketches be tailored towards the application of relevance?
Yes. It's a good question. So oftentimes people will hand us the same biosketch that they've been using over and over, but it should be tailored to the specific science in the application. Thanks for that question. Okay, so at any rate, while we're bringing these documents together, we're looking for various things like, are page limits being adhered to? Does the research plan have all the required sections? Do all the publications in the biosketch and bibliography have PMCID numbers as required by the public access, NIH public access policy? We work with the investigator to bring all these documents together and then also upload those into InfoEd. And sometimes, depending upon the application, these applications can be 75 pages or more. So after the budget's determined and entered into InfoEd, the application documents have been reviewed and uploaded into InfoEd. And the final application has been reviewed by the investigator. It's routed to the department for departmental review. And that review either happens by Jane, Natalie, or myself, depending upon who's completing the application. This allows for a second set of eyes to look over everything to make sure the application is complete. And then it's routed to grants and contracts for institutional review. So for institutional review, grants and contracts is going to review the RFA and the application side by side. They're going to be checking to see if we can receive funding and comply with the sponsor's policies and requirements. Most of our funding comes from the NIH, so that's usually not a problem. But there might be sponsors, say, for example, sponsors who are outside the US, and the US may not be able to receive funding for them due to federal regulation or legislation. Or a funder might have intellectual property policies that Dana-Farber cannot comply with. So grants and contracts is also looking to see if the application structure was followed. And again, this also includes whether the required sections were into science. Does the budget make sense given the anticipated project start date and duration? If any, were effort minimums met in the budget? Was the fringe rate calculated correctly? Are all the documents present and correct? So while this is happening, there's a back and forth that happens between grants and contracts and the research administrator, and sometimes the research administrator back to the investigator. Sometimes they'll ask questions, or they'll have comments, or they'll have corrections of various items in the application. So once the needed corrections are made and grants and contracts have submitted the application to the sponsor, if we're lucky, and the application gets a good score, actually, if not, if we're lucky, if the application is just good, we'll receive what's called a just-in-time request, also called a JIT request. That usually comes with a very tight deadline of about a week. In the just-in-time request, they'll ask for things like the other support page and for personnel listed on the application. And this is basically a document that contains the current and pending support of key personnel in the application. Verification of human subjects and animal training, if applicable. And then finally, sometimes they will ask for additional clarification about certain aspects of the application. And receiving a JIT request doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be funded. But if all goes well, the sponsor will award the funds, and then we move on towards the post-award process. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Love.
So my name's Love, and I'm going to talk about the post-award side of grants management, but I also just want to take a step back and just remind you that grants management is one portion of what the research administrators do. So I'm going to explain the post-award side, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about what falls under that larger research administration part. So as Shawn mentioned, not all submissions are awarded. So pre-award activities are often very hectic and stressful. And up until the moment the submit button is pushed, all of that effort could be for naught. But that is the reality of the research administrator. So the first slide I'm going to show you is this timeline to the funding decision. So the biggest difference between pre-award and post-award is that the grant submission stage has a definitive end. So there's a straightforward checklist of requirements. Shawn went through a bunch of those. And the research administrator and also the PI might have worked on a particular application for months. But once it is submitted, that pre-award phase is over. And then we wait and we wait and we wait and we wait. And the wait can vary. It looks like from 8 months to 20 months. And then we get to that next phase, which is that JIT request and the transition from pre-award to post-award. So the length of the actual post-award phase that I'm going to talk about varies between with the type of award. But the only thing that's for sure is that the post-award phase lasts beyond the grant's end date. So in a lot of cases, we're talking years for the post-award phase. So this transition, this lengthy transition between when the pre-award ends and the post-award begins, that is a natural break in the process. And that allows some research administrators to focus exclusively on pre-award or post-award. Shawn and I do both. So this looks familiar. So similar to pre-award, the post-award phase also begins with a document. So in the pre-award phase, you have the funding opportunity announcement or the request for application, request for proposal. For a post-award, the initial document that kicks it off is the notice of award. And all of these examples that I'm mentioning are using the language of the National Institutes of Health and its institutes and centers, because as Shawn mentioned, that's where most of our funding comes from. But all of the funders are going to have some version of a notice of award. So much of the notice of award is going to be standard boilerplate language that is not specific to the particular project that has been funded. But there are key pieces of information that we need from the notice of award. And those include the funding level. Was it fully funded? It's really important. Was there a cut? If there was a cut, was it temporary because of a continuing resolution? And then Congress might, pass a budget and then we might get more money. That happens. The project dates, do they match what was submitted? Did the project period shift? Or, and this is especially fun, is the initial project period different from 12 months? I've seen shorter and I've also seen longer. So those are things that we have to account for when we are setting up a project. Are there any special conditions? So there aren't always. This is a section that researchers administrators rely on because it differentiates one R01 award from another R01 award. These are additional criteria that apply to that particular award. So for example, are there additional personnel who are going to be listed as key personnel? And if so, then they have more reporting requirements and they also have effort restrictions. Are there effort requirements because of the type of award? Is there a foreign component that was requested and that is being given permission for in the notice of award? And so these details will ensure that we are compliant with the sponsor expectations specific, again, to that particular award. And then once we understand the award, we can move on to setting up the project internally, which we do with our grants and contracts department. So project setup will always involve a budget, and I'll have an example of that. And then other things of if there's some contract that's going to be part of the budget, so that would be included. And then that's a whole separate step part of the project setup, same with consultants and billing agreements. The post-award management side, once the project is set up, this is where our real day-to-day work of the post-award research administrator happens. We live in this box. These are the typical post-award management tasks that are happening behind the scenes. So we allocate staff. We use our PeopleSoft HR system. We obtain purchase order numbers for publications or supplies using our PeopleSoft financial management system. We reimburse for travel. We keep track of future personnel changes and salary changes so that we can adjust the effort in real time and not overspend the project. We also approve subcontract invoices and reconcile the subcontract encumbrance for the sub-agreement. We charge for computing, which is how we support our vital systems team. Listed out like this, all of these things that I have mentioned can appear to be self-contained tasks. I assure you, they each involve many stages and can span months to completion. So one example that you would be familiar with is travel. So as an example, the research administrator receives your travel authorization form. We make sure that the correct project number, in some cases projects, have the funds available for the travel. We encumber the estimated cost so that we know the money is earmarked for spending. It's not still available. And then sometimes we have to follow up with the traveler to make sure that we get their receipts and their reimbursement form after the travel happens. And then we check the receipts for any unallowable charges. We double check all of the totals. And then once we submit the form for reimbursement, we still have to monitor the project to make sure that the expense hits the right project and the right account. Suffice to say that travel as a post-award task is surprisingly involved. You can help us by providing accurate estimates prior to travel and by submitting your receipts and forms promptly. You'll notice that I have troubleshooting as a post-award task. Troubleshooting is a regular activity. It is a feature of research administration. It is not a bug. In the travel example, occasionally we have to follow up with accounts payable for delayed reimbursement or with research accounting to move an expense from one project to another. The type of troubleshooting is going to vary, but the fact that there is troubleshooting to do is very much a part of research administration. And I have some examples of that. Okay. So some of our common challenges in the world of research administration. These are the constraints that we have to work within. For example, the R01. It is a very common grant mechanism. It has 3 deadlines a year. So it is probable that at some point a research administrator is going to have more than one PI submitting an R01 for the same deadline. As Shawn mentioned, in data science, we submit a high volume of subcontracts. So we often have multiple subcontracts going in for any given deadline. Delays are a fact of life. Sometimes we are able to set up an advanced project so that we can start spending as if the project were fully available, and then the paperwork can catch up later. But sometimes our data science personnel are part of another department's grant, and all we can do is wait. A PCF, the personnel change form, that is how we allocate staff to the various projects. But it turns out that what we enter into PeopleSoft is then rekeyed by someone in HR, and occasionally numbers are transposed or mistyped. It is an easy fix, but once we recognize that that's what happened. So we don't always. Some contracts. Sub-recipient monitoring could be a training in itself. Long story short, in addition to managing our own expenses on a project, a research administrator has to pay attention to the sub-site expenses and check in with them if they are not invoicing timely or if their rate of spending appears to be over or under the amount of their subaward. We have to do this for each sub-site. One of my projects has 5 sub-sites. So it is definitely a challenge, but it's common enough that we can do it. Just as in our personal budgets, surprise expenses are never good. When it happens, like when a travel expense is higher than expected, or worse, when there is unexpected travel, research administrators need to rebalance a budget by underspending in another category. I mentioned that project setup will always include a budget, and Shawn showed you an example of what was submitted. So I'm going to show you an example of how a budget might change once the award comes in. And then I'm going to share with you some of the tricky allocations. When we talk about effort on a project, 10%, 25%, it seems straightforward. In reality, a lot of our people are on multiple projects, and so it takes some extra balancing. So I'll show you an example of that also. Okay. So you saw an example of a budget that was submitted. So this is just a zoom in to the one line item level of, here we had a person who had $100,000 salary, and again, we collect 28% fringe on top of the salary. That's for things like health insurance and under benefits. In addition, this person's going to be on for 10%. So we combine those first two, get 10% of that. And then on top of it, we have to do the institute's indirect cost rate. So Shawn mentioned our rate is 78%. And that's a federally negotiated rate, and it can change. So what happens is our submitted budget, $22,784, and then we get the award, and we're so happy that we got the award. However, it was not fully funded. There was a cut, and we only get 20,000. So how much effort can this person be allocated to? And it turns out that, again, it's not static. Once something is submitted, things change. All of these variables change. So now the person is at a higher salary, 105,000. And so you do the math, solve for X, and we get 8.4% roughly of their effort. I just would remind you that this is one line item and that the research administrator would do this for all personnel on the budget and then any other cost categories. And then we would submit it to our PI for review. So I mentioned that allocations, that what we were just looking at is like the one grant view. We can also look at the one person view, and each person can only be allocated to 100% of their effort. And we have all of these projects at any one given time, and they support a different total per project, but we have to somehow get to that 100% every month for their allocations. And so what we do, again, using that system PeopleSoft, is some creative bookkeeping. So, for example, if we see Project D supports 50% of this person's effort, and Project D is coming to a close at the end of June, and then it won't have any support. So we're going to need to make up 50% of effort. Well, we also see Project B is able to support a very high level of effort, but we can't allocate this person 50% to these two projects because they have 5 projects. So what we're going to have to do is when Project B starts, we're going to have to bring it in at a lower level of effort and adjust some of the other ones a little lower so that the total stays at 100%. And then once Project D ends, we're able to increase the new project up to the full level of support. And then later, we're going to have to massage it again just to make sure that we're keeping the average to what the project is able to support and what the research needs. And now, some uncommon challenges. So these are the issues that we ask one another. Have you ever seen this before? Some of these are systems issues. Some of these are communication issues. Some of them are genuine mysteries. These uncommon challenges often require fixing by other departments, and they are issues that sometimes need to be addressed by senior leadership. In all cases, they have to be resolved. We can't see it and then like ignore it. It has to be like figured out. So I have a few examples. So one of them, just recently last week, I learned of a project that was a duplicate project. So I had all these people allocated and I'd been spending, and the project was set up and I noticed it's still in estimated status. And I'm like, this is weird, but it was just executed. It was just fully signed. So maybe it's just a delay of a month or two. And then, you know, I noticed again. So finally I get to the point where I contact our research administrator and I said, you know, can you look into this? The project was fully executed and it's still an estimated status. And she responded that this is the project number associated with that grant, totally different project, and 0 allocations because I didn't know about it. And I searched my email and I don't find that project. And I was like, okay, communication issue. I never found this. I was not told about it. It was a continuing year. So the previous year had rolled over, but we had a change in research accounting. The new person took over, set up the new project, and was, I guess, not aware that there was an existing project that people were already allocated to. And once all of this was unraveled, it's like, okay, this is a very easy fix. She was able to cancel that duplicate project and make mine the actual project and fully open it. And now, after months of being open, that project can finally send invoices to the Prime site. So very unusual situation, but in that case, an easy fix. This next one is, it's very quirky, but it's just, again, another example of the troubleshooting that we have to do. So IDC recovery. So when we are a prime grant and we have a subcontract that's going out, the subcontract that's going out is subject to indirect costs for Dana-Farber for the first $25,000. This is all in the weeds. What you need to know is that amount is captured for Dana-Farber because it's reflecting the fact that it takes our time, research administrators' time, grants and contracts time, all of these internal people to set up that outgoing project. So Dana-Farber recoups some of that money that's allowed by NIH through this program called IDC Recovery. So what happened was anytime an institution, a PI changes institutions, we have to do that paperwork again because awards are made to the institution, not to the PI, as it happens. And so there's more paperwork involved. And so then it makes sense. Okay, new paperwork, so new IDC recovery on that new subcontract. In this case, Fred Hutch had a name change. It went from like Cancer Research Center to Cancer Center. It was like a really minor change, but it required them to issue all new outgoing subcontracts and accept all new incoming subcontracts on their end. Everything, all of their paperwork had to be redone. I can't even imagine. But on our end, what it would mean is that a new subcontract would have meant 78% on the $25,000 that was going to them. So almost $20,000 that we didn't budget for. But this kind of case didn't represent a new award or a new collaboration or anything. It was this administrative thing that was a quirk. And so that in that case, it required going to senior leadership and requesting a waiver for that very specific uncommon challenge. And it worked. We were able to not have to pay that extra money. They just waived that. Not much to say about institution applications when a PI is changing sites, except for that they are very time consuming. They, that's it. That's all you can say about that. They take a long time. Okay. So the next one, so IDC calculating weirdly late IDC adjustment. All of this is to say that the systems that we use are not perfect, and we keep our own shadow systems as sort of a double check, and also because we know of future changes that aren't going to be reflected in our accounting systems. So for example, there's going to be a merit increase on 7/1 or 10/1. We can project that into our future expenses and then have a more realistic view of what we're encumbering. Whereas, our PeopleSoft system is only going to take the salary at the moment and extend it to the end of the year at whatever effort it is listed at. And we're going to know that it's not accurate. So we have our shadow system. So there was this one case where, well, maybe not one case, but for me, in this particular instance, there was this IDC that was calculating weirdly. It visually was not what it was supposed to be. And so I had to interact with our research accounting and, try and get that figured out. And the problem with that is it can mean that what you're looking at in the system isn't accurate. And sometimes it's inaccurate in your favor and you have more money. Sometimes it's inaccurate not in your favor and you actually should be spending, more than it says. And in either case, that's not good, because that's like literally our job is to manage that project. And if we can't trust the system we're using, that's a problem. So we have these backup spreadsheets that can, double check things, and we see something like that and we have to initiate the fix. And then the final one that I have listed there is the fringe calculating weirdly. And for this one, I will give you a sneak peek behind the scenes. This is an example of our accounting system, PeopleSoft, for the expenses. So what it shows you is the description, salary, expenses, fringe benefits, and then we have the control budget is what we're expecting to spend throughout the award. And then the encumbered amount, that's the amount that's still to be billed. The actual amount is the amount that has actually already been charged to that, and then the available total. So again, we said our fringe rate is 28%. And so very clearly there's a problem. So I was doing my monthly reconciling and I noticed, so basically if the salary were $10,000 with a fringe rate of 28%, we would expect $2,800 for fringe. Clearly, in this case, the amount is over $10,000. So you would expect over 2,800, and it is less than 2,800. So how on earth? I don't know. So I brought this to the attention of our research accountant, and one of our research administrators on our team looked into the actual monthly expenses, and we found that this fringe problem only happened for the months of January and February. For whatever reason, there was no fringe assessed on this project. It's a mystery, genuine mystery. Don't know what happened. And then now here we are going on 6 weeks later, and we've had 2 attempts to fix it with a help desk ticket with IS support to no avail. This is what it looks like as of like 2 days ago. And we're gonna keep trying. Clearly, the award ends next week. So this is going to now be a higher priority item because now we need to get into project closeout and really resolve what this issue is. So this is just one of the examples that is, in this case, an uncommon challenge, but all of these challenges really are what keep this job really fresh and different and sometimes exciting, as frustrating as it can be. So I do feel satisfaction once these kinds of things are figured out and resolved. Okay, so we hope that this has given you some insight into the day-to-day work life of the research administrator and how we can keep things moving forward behind the scenes while you do things in the grant research world. And that with this understanding, you will be better able to work with your research administrator. Any questions?
Just from personal experience, I
Please.
often get asked what seems way too late to join in on a grant submission. Deadline will be approaching like maybe days or hopefully weeks, but sometimes months ahead. Just from your perspective, you know, we have all these internal deadlines, but that's like the deadline. When is your preferred, what's your preferred buffer range? Like if there is a grant due, you know, May 15th, is it doable, or do you want like 2 months minimum or something like that?
I can take on this pre-award question. Sure. So for me, I'm totally comfortable sticking within the data science research administrator deadline. So if we say, and it's a hard question to answer because now the Institute is changing to the 2 days and the 5 days, and then that's before the sponsor deadline, as Shawn was mentioning, all these deadlines. We established a deadline that we would need to receive materials by so that we can do all of those things, uploading into InfoEd. All those documents have to be, you know, individual and that kind of thing. If we're talking about a subcontract, especially, then yeah, that deadline is going to be fine to receive all of the materials and to submit. If we're talking about something that is bigger, like an actual prime application, say an R01 that has science components and that sort, then advanced notice would be fine, but we would still, you know, we have that deadline and that's when we should be expected to get the materials and be able to do it. So advance notice doesn't necessarily mean advance, you know, receipt of materials. Sure. But I thank you for asking that question. It's going to get kind of hairy in the next couple of months as this new timeline rolls out. Anyone else?
This is just a random question. I'm not faculty, so I'm not applying to R01s and things like this, but do people typically over apply to things in hopes that something gets funded? And how do you reconcile if all of them get funded and all of a sudden they're out of work effort? Because there's such a lag time. What if, you know, something that's a good thing, but also how do you deal with that issue?
Well, that doesn't often happen, but sometimes there are situations where a PI will have to turn down one of those.
Okay, that's what would happen.
Yeah, we want to avoid that. But
Right.
and then also there's sometimes when the sponsors will say things like, if concurrently you receive X kind of award, then we can't award to. Sometimes it's an automatic fix.
I would say, so part of Shawn's answer was that it's uncommon, and yeah, it's definitely not common. I think there could be other factors that would make that reality happen. So for example, when COVID happened and we couldn't hire, all of a sudden I did have one PI who had all this extra funding and he couldn't allocate, he didn't have the people to allocate to the new grants. So in some cases, you're able to accept it to start the work, and then maybe the PI can have higher effort. Oftentimes the PI might be on something for, 5 or 10%. Well, without a postdoc to work on the project, maybe the PI can increase effort and spend some of that money and get the project started. One thing that we can do is we might be able to carry forward funds from one year to another within a limit. So that kind of can protect those research dollars, and so that you wouldn't have to refuse, but we would definitely have to be in communication with the PI and also the grants office, and then they would be in touch with NIH to kind of make sure that we're all on the same page. I also have another example of a PI whose R01 ended up having these extra funds, and because of the hiring freeze, instead of doing a carry forward, which happens at the end of the year, NIH decided to do a restructure. So instead of a 5-year award, it became a 6-year award. And they decided that at year 3 so that we knew our future funding, instead of, kind of being at the mercy of, we're going to have this high carry forward and how do we, it's not guaranteed. Where the restructure, it was guaranteed, as so far as grants are guaranteed.
It probably also depends on whether 2 applications are deemed to be overlapping in the scientific effort.
Okay.
I don't know if is that a thing that you judge or that the NIH judges? If there's like significant overlap.
Right, yeah. So part of the other support documentation has a line to point out overlap between projects, either scientific overlap or financial overlap. That is definitely not a decision that I would make. But yeah, if that decision is made, then that would be who does it.
There's some weird, I don't think I've personally had this, but I've heard of scenarios where like there's such a lag and a delay for the review process. You might be on the bubble of whether it's gonna get funded or not. And then the resubmission deadline has already passed. So people just go ahead and resubmit. And then you have 2 active submissions basically at the same time.
I can imagine 20 months of time, like so many.
Yeah,
things to
exactly.
happen.
You're just gonna go ahead and resubmit.
Yeah, that
and then you're
definitely.
gonna decide, like, maybe you get the first one and you get to withdraw the second one or some kind of weird.
Right, that definitely happens, and it definitely creates confusion because then we have 2 numbers associated with it, and grants and contracts or research administration, like they might try and open the resubmission, but it was the original that was funded. It's like, yeah, very true.
And hopefully the investigators contact program.
Right.
So that.
Love, can you hear me
Yes.
okay?
I sure
Hi.
can. Go ahead, Anne.
So similar, I guess a related question is if aren't PIs supposed to, when they receive grant award, do they have an annual compliance report to give to the government, for example? And so, for example, if one project within the grant, they didn't receive the samples, so I guess what you said, they could ask for a carryover, but has there also ever been a time where funds have to be returned because the work, for any reason, couldn't be accomplished? Or do they try and just rework the project? Do you understand my question?
I definitely understand your question. So to answer the first part, yes, there is annual reporting requirement for NIH grants. It's the RPPR, Research Progress Report. I don't know what it's, but the RPPR, the progress report is where they would acknowledge an underspending, and depending on how significant it is. So for example, you're allowed to carry over up to 25% of the unobligated balance, like the original amount of the award. If you have under 25%, then there's really no penalty or no special effort to carry that forward. So you would acknowledge the unobligated balance in the progress report, which is, a month and a half before the new project period. But to answer the second part of your question of whether funds, have been returned, yes. It's not something that we want to do, but I know, especially again with some of the COVID hiring freezes and if you just couldn't get, you couldn't justify spending that money in another way, because in the budget it was for personnel and that personnel was not hired. And so, there are consequences to the research part that have to be explained. And then, depending on, whether you have someone in mind to hire or whether you're just actively seeking but don't have anyone lined up, that could also depend on how much you are allowed to carry over. Because it's not all or nothing. You can carry over a portion of what's unobligated. Really, it's the research that should drive what you're asking for. And so that would be explained, and then they make their decision based on that.
That's the question. Also, it's like non-faculty master services. Is there anything that you wish like we knew? We're kind of removed from a lot of this process. Is there anything helpful? And it's interesting to learn what action is happening, but anything we can do. I think you mentioned like having a bio sketches account would solve issues down the line.
Right, yeah, so I appreciate that question. So Morgan's question was about whether master's level statisticians can take into account some of this information and what would be beneficial most for them. So one example, so you mentioned BioSketch. That would, I guess part of the answer depends on what your future career path is. If you're on a track to be a master statistician and years from now you're going to be a senior level master statistician who can actually be a PI on a subcontract, then a lot of this stuff is going to be relevant to you at that time. As of right now, one of the things that would be really helpful insofar as you interact with us at all, mostly it's going to be something like a travel request. And I've seen travel requests where it's like, $1,000, but there's no details. Or I've seen, $300 for a flight that's actually going to be $600. And so those kinds of things would be really beneficial for us to have a more accurate idea of what the expenses are, because at the end of the day, we're kind of accountant people, bean counters, Shawn likes to say. And so that's one example. The hiring packet, I think that everybody got when they started, there's a lot of information in there. That's probably where things like having an ERA Commons ID is mentioned, and there's like the steps on how to get that and who needs it. And I would start with that document and just make sure, because it seems really important when you get here, but then the longer you're here, the less you refer to it, and maybe everything in there didn't get done. I would start with that, and then just notice. I think that's sort of the biggest thing for all of us is advance notice for things like travel, for things like effort changes, or changing from one PI to another. That's a thing that master statisticians do a lot, is have multiple PIs supervise different parts of their job. And so working with your PI and working with your research administrator, if we know of changes in advance of when they're going to happen, that also helps us to plan. Shawn, do you have anything?
I'll mention next slide, but the next one.
Hey, yeah. So Shawn was thinking ahead.
Yeah.
Some resources. So BioSketch instructions, data science intranet page has some details on different aspects of the research administration. And
You mentioned travel a couple times. Do we have any systems in place to have things billed directly on a departmental account of some kind, or is it only on a reimbursement?
yeah, that's an excellent question. So we do, in fact, when people are submitting that travel authorization form, there is a place in there to have the department make the travel arrangements on your behalf. So airfare doesn't have to be covered out of pocket. And that has actual extra protections built into it, in addition to like not having to wait for the reimbursement. But yeah, it has extra travel protections built into it that I would definitely recommend for people to take advantage of that. And we have specific people who handle travel. So you're not just sending it off and then it'll be done. Like they'll actually contact you and make sure that they get flights that work for you, and you can provide specific flights that you're looking at.
That covers like conference registration fees and other stuff like that. too.
Yeah, so not necessarily through that travel form, but that actually, thank you, that's something that research administrators can do. We can register you for the conference in advance and use the department credit card to make that payment so that, again, you're not floating that up to $1,000 sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
I think I've noticed a lot of people lately have opted to make their own arrangements, and I think it's just easier, you know, like if like it's changed and stuff, they feel like they won't get contacted directly, but we don't use third party, we don't use like Expedia or anything to book it. We will book directly through the hotel, through the whatever airline you want. So there's not that third party that you're gonna have to deal with. So it wasn't worth the effort anymore to go through this.
Yes, but I imagine like, we don't have a ton of students, but we could have some, and like for a student to cover $1,000 registration fee and airfare and,
Right.
you know, 5 days at a hotel in San Diego or something like that adds up real fast, and then you have to wait 6 months to get reimbursed often, so.
Yeah, especially when the registration is so far in advance.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, excellent point, for sure.
And on the travel piece, I know that my position is $800 a year, I think, towards those type of expenses. If that's not enough to go to a conference, which often it probably
Right.
isn't, what kind of happens in that case, or do you try to pull that out of?
Right, so yeah, so
Like that.
that's an actual real world experience. Yes, so master statisticians do have $800 available from like the general department funds, thank you, discretionary funds. But yes, depending on which project you're traveling for, which grant you're working on, a lot of people travel for ECOG. Depending on what project you're traveling for, there would be funds available ideally on that project itself. And then a research administrator, would do a split payment behind the scenes. Again, you would still get one lump sum reimbursement, but we would split out $800 to the discretionary and then the rest to the relevant project. But that'd be a conversation that you would have with your PI for sure. Like when you submit that travel authorization form, that is going to your PI so that they can say which project is going to cover that expense. And then once they approve it, it comes to us to say, yes, you have permission. And then if you do select to have the arrangements made, then it would further go to the people who would do that.
Our comp bio folks get the same.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry, that's new. So now all computation biologists get that same funding.
Fantastic.
Collaborative team.
Oh, yes, yes. Any other questions?
I have a quick question. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah. If could you go back maybe to the slide that says budget revisions, I think for a visual, but I was just wondering about the I know Shawn touched on like the actual, I was wondering about the actual computation and I guess more like the order of operations, if you want to call it that, like, you know, what are percentages of what, you know? So it's like salary and then fringe tacked onto that, that's split up by effort, and then the indirect is layered on top of that.
Yes, correct. So the salary is where we start, and then we take 28%, just add 28% to that. So this person would be 128,000 as like one number, and then 10% of that. And then all of that is what gets the 78% indirect cost.
Okay, so the indirect is 78% of everything up to that point, you know, in parentheses or whatever, that amount.
Right, yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'd been pulled into people were asking questions about that at one point, and I was, you know, that was my first exposure to some of those terms. So it's good to hear. Yep.
Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
So
Yes.
when you mentioned a lot of like communication with obviously the NIH and other federal agencies. So, and you mentioned that they could change the indirect cost at any time. Like how do you guys get notified of, or they could, you know, change the budget on a grant? Like how do you?
Yeah, so two things. So the first part is the indirect cost rate. There's an indirect cost rate agreement, and that comes annually. So that's not grant specific. That's institute specific. So Dana-Farber is at 78%. Other institutions are different, a little behind the scenes. So we have a organization like our professional organization. One of them is NCURA, the National Council of University Research Administrators. I mention this because the very first time I went to one of these luncheons with, breakout sessions and all that, when we sat down for lunch, one of the people had an icebreaker. Her question was, so what's everyone's indirect cost rate? And I thought it was the most kind of nerdy thing to ask. But then I was fascinated by the responses because some people had, as low as 55% and some people had 110%. And it like totally depends on, what kind of infrastructure you have and where in the country you're located and all that. So the indirect cost rate is annual and it is federally negotiated. It applies to all of the federal awards that come to Dana-Farber. And then different funders would have, their own maximum allowable rate. Like a Chan Zuckerberg might have, I think 15% is what they allow. And so then the Institute kind of has to make up the difference. So we use the indirect cost is what covers things like the rent for the building and the electricity and like all these things that, you're not asking for it when you're doing research on a grant. You're not saying, and I need to, have this computer in my office and plug it in and how much electricity does that use? So that's what's behind the indirect cost rate. I think the other part of your question was about when we get notified about that. So the indirect cost rate actually could be locked in. Sometimes whatever the was submitted is maintained even if the rate itself has changed. So if our rate is it increased or lower, like we're allowed to get a lower rate, but if the rate has gone higher and we submitted lower, but if the rate has gone lower, we can't accept a higher rate, right? Like there's some kind of thing behind the scenes like that. The fringe rate similarly is also negotiated and set annually. So those don't happen from the NIH necessarily, but once we get the award, so say our fringe rate fluctuated a couple of years ago and it went down to 25% for all faculty and staff. Prior to that, we had separate rates, one for faculty and one for the staff. So this is much easier to have the one rate. But so what happens is we have to use whatever the actual fringe rate is, because that's how we pay people and all that. But the IDC rate, most likely it's going to be what it actually is, and it doesn't change by as much. But the awarded budget, when that comes, it's going to say, here's how much you have available. And then again, we kind of set up these algebraic equations and go back to, how much how much effort, it always comes back for us. How much effort are we gonna allocate this person at?
Love, I just want to mention something. So a few minutes ago, you mentioned the chair's discretionary fund for master statisticians. I had to step away, so I just want to be clear that those monies are also available to the master's level computational biologists. And I actually have to reach out to everybody and make sure that they're aware of that opportunity. Okay.
Thank you, Anne. Yes. Anything else? All right. Well, once again, thank you for coming and thank you for your questions. That's an added bonus.